So that's how it's probabilistic. It's actually been used in quite a range of applications. I thought I had some more on the... I thought I had some in the slides, but I may have accidentally wiped them out. Because I've also got extensions in the slides. I didn't quite want to move on to the extensions into showing you what the... yeah. Okay, so let's just see if I actually put in the examples after the extensions. Okay, so yeah, this is what I often do with the latent space in these models. So this is the sort of plot I wanted to show. So what I'm visualizing here, and this is one of the extensions to the model, what I'm visualizing here is some motion capture of a stick man walking, and he does like 3 strides. And you're seeing in the latent space, you're seeing the x positions, right? So each of these is an x position. It's a 2-dimensional latent space. But then we've also visualized this white cloud. And what the white cloud is, you know I said how the manifold's flapping about in data space. The white cloud is the precision of the manifold in data space, so the inverse variance. So if it's white, the manifold's not flapping about. But if it's black, the manifold's flapping about. It doesn't know what's going on. So obviously you see where there's data, you get the manifold being well determined. But where there's no data, it doesn't know what goes on here. Yeah, there's high variance here. Now something interesting happens for this data set, which is why it's used as an example here, is actually this data set's a time series. The man starts in a crouched position and then he does 3 strides like this. But in this example, it's split up the time series. And this is because the man actually changes angle of run. So it's a shame I don't have this demo working. I do have it kind of working perhaps in GPy. This is the one demo that's sort of working in GPy. So maybe we'll look at it after lunch. And it turns out that these parts of the stride here are where the man's in the same pose. Yeah? So on the 2 different strides. He's actually at a different angle. So he changes angle as he runs because he sort of starts crouching and then he goes up like that. So the model wants to line up the times when he's at the same angle. It scores likelihood for making these things close together. Yeah? It should also want to line up these things which are at different times. So in data space, in our observed space, this point is very close to this point. But in the latent space, it's not. It doesn't do that because to do that, it has to do something like this. So that's the actual path of the run. But if you've seen what it's done, it's almost like we're looking down a 3D thing. You can imagine that this is a cylinder, that there's a piece of string being wrapped around a cylinder. And the reason it wants to do that is because the angle of these runs are different. It can't just map these things directly on top of each other because then it doesn't get the angle right. So what it's done here, it's been forced to keep this time series together. And what it's done here is the model isn't good at this point and the model isn't good at that point because really those are 2 different angles. But the model's having to map it down to 1 in order to keep this circle together. Now it turns out that the model would overall prefer to split those angles up given a 2-dimensional latent space. Because here it's constrained to do everything with 2 dimensions. It would prefer to split them up so it can get those angles of run correct. Why doesn't it want to wrap them around? Well, it's like inner groove distortion on a record, on old long playing records. On the outside, the record spins at a constant amount, just like the covariance is isotropic. So you've got the same amount of representational thing. But on the outside, you have all that distance for representing the music, like a second of music or something. Not a second, but say 0.1 of a second. Whereas on the inside, you only have that distance to represent the music. So on a record, old style record, actually the thing that stores the signal, the stylus signals, are much more spaced out on the outside than on the inside. Whereas here, it's a uniform isotropic plane. So it would be a big compromise for it to do that, to go inside the circle like that. So it doesn't want to do that. So what it rather do is, Edison had these alternative types of record because of this inner groove distortion. Edison thought records should be on cylinders because that meant that you always had the same amount of length. and they span around and around and like this, and you had the needle. And that got rid of inner groove distortion. They were just more awkward to carry. They were less convenient. So it never caught on, even though Edison sort of invented the record. And here it's trying to do something like that. It's trying to line up everything together, but it can't create a cylinder. Here it's even trying to create a cylinder. It can't create a cylinder, so it does something else. So there are these sort of interesting issues, and people, when I first, so this is visualized here, that if I map these points out, you see the different angle of run? You see why it wants to separate those? Because point A is that angle and point D is that angle. But some people sort of say, but I don't want it to split up the time series. The time series is important to me. So, and a lot of dimensionality reduction methods wouldn't do that. So with Joaquin Quiñonero Candela, we came up with a constraint that stopped it doing that. So most dimensionality reduction techniques actually preserve local distances. So if I'm doing multidimensional scaling, I said that what I do is I compute some set of distances from y. Let's say dij is the distance between, a square distance I often think of, between 2 points yi and yj. And I want to create some distance, some latent distance in latent space, which approximates this. Now most approaches will say that the thing to do is, if two things are close together in data space, keep them close in latent space. Yeah? That seems totally intuitively sensible, doesn't it? So if I find in data space that I've got two things that are close together, they should also be close in latent space. Now, I need a cable. So what these methods are saying is, if I have a cable, I've got my laptop cable, I'll just unplug that. These methods are saying, so here's my latent space. Yeah, so things that are close in data space are close in latent space. Yeah? Aren't they? Not necessarily. Not if the manifold folds on itself. It's an assumption, and it's an incorrect assumption for general manifolds. So it's an assumption that holds if the manifold doesn't fold on itself. Now, manifolds are less likely to fold on themselves the higher dimensional they are. So this folds on itself easily because it's in low dimensions. But actually, if you start imagining very high dimensions, if you start imagining these Gaussian process manifolds which are independent across, as long as they're independent across each dimension, then the probability of them folding over on themselves as dimensions approaches like 1,000 is 0. They won't fold over on themselves. You can see that. So it's a good assumption very often. But it's not the correct assumption. You can construct cases where they will fold over on themselves. So the GPLVM doesn't have that assumption in it. Now, if you have that assumption, a lot of manifold methods become convex. It becomes convex solutions to reconstruct the manifold. So it's a nice assumption to incorporate. But the GPLVM isn't convex because it doesn't have that assumption in it. So what goes on in the GPLVM is different. This happens if you believe the mapping is from, if you say X is a smooth mapping from Y. If that's true, that means, right, by smooth, I almost mean to define it like this, right? If things are close in data, by smooth I mean they'll be close in latent. Does that make sense? So this is really, this mapping underpins this assumption, a mapping from Y to X. Two things are close here, they'll be close in the latent space. But the GPLVM does it the other way. It says Y is equal to F of X. So what that means is if things are close in latent space, they will be close in data space. But just because things are close in data space, that could just be a result of a non-bijective function. So that's what the next slide shows. So modeling from latent to data with a nonlinear function, right? So 2 points here are distant on latent space, but they come close in data space because they map to the same position. Yeah? That's where the mapping goes from X to Y. So that's how it can happen. And the assumption in most methods like kernel PCA and classical multidimensional scaling is that can't happen. But that is the generative way of looking at data. And, it's the right way of describing, it's the only general way of describing how this string moves in a 3D space. I have to describe the string, I have to take the one-dimensional position of the string and say how it maps into 3D. So we were talking earlier, I can't remember with who, about protein folding. Yeah, this is the right way of describing protein folding. You have to say, you map from the one-dimensional position along the protein, we were talking about it, weren't we, to the three-dimensional position in space. The mapping goes that way. It does not go from the three-dimensional position in space to the one-dimensional position on the protein because the protein folds over on itself. That would be totally crazy. It wouldn't work. It's a non-bijective mapping. So this is the situation that people are suggesting is what goes on. So 2 points now in data space that are far apart can map close in latent space if you do the mapping the other way. So this means things can fold over on themselves in the wrong way. So things that were far apart, that's impossible for this model. Yeah, you can't have 2 points that are far apart. It's because it's, the mapping's going in the other way now. So unless you've got a multi-mapping from latent to data, this can't happen. It's saying basically that you've got 2 points in latent space, and this actually turns into something called the pre-image problem in kernel PCA. 2 points in latent space that are right close together, in this case map to a person, and this case maps to a tree. That's exactly what this says. No, which is kind of odd. It's not what you expect. So if you were to move around, this whole moving around the latent space the guy did with the latent doodle space, and everything was smooth, that's because the mapping's in the correct direction. If you were to be able to solve this pre-image problem, then with these other latent variable methods, you could get this effect that you move from man to tree to dog to cat, just as you move slowly around. So that's clearly wrong, yeah? I feel it's definitely wrong. But it's a reasonable assumption if your data is very high dimensional, because once you get very high dimensional, like I say, if P is really large, and each of these dimensions is sampled independently, you can show that everything becomes bijective, basically. Statistically, you don't end up with these problems happening. So if P is very, very large, this is perhaps a non-issue. But it's an important sort of what's going on, what's the difference between this model and not. But still, so what we wanted to do with this back constraints work was copy what Mike Tipping did with that multidimensional scaling work and force this same mapping. So force a forward and a back mapping. So basically we say we're going to encode, so we've got this probabilistic model, we've got a probability distribution that is a probability of y given x, and now we're going to force x to equal a deterministic function. So I'll not call it f, because f's always a Gaussian process, isn't it? I'll call it g. So g of y. So we force this mapping back in, and we can do that because these are just parameters, and we're just constraining these parameters. Now, one way of thinking about what we're doing here is an autoencoder. So we're going from y, I don't know if you've seen autoencoders. If you haven't, I'm not going to explain them, through g of x to x, and then we go from x through the probabilistic mapping f of x to y. Through g of y, sorry. Yeah? So this is like called an autoencoder. It's going from some y down to some reduced space. It's an autoencoder because this model encodes itself. You encode each data point through some squashing function out to itself again. So we call this back constraints, and it's proved very popular. You can put any function in here, like a neural network, an RBF network, a kernel-based mapping, and it does things like this. It changes the model. Now that the constraints are in both directions, it gets results that are lower likelihood. This was a constraint. This result is lower likelihood than the result on the left. But the model isn't correct. If we had the correct latent dimensionality, which is, I think is 4 in this case, then actually it would manage to do both these things. But it can't represent everything because it's not got the correct, it's the incorrect model. So it breaks, and it breaks in this direction. And people are saying, I don't want to break in that direction, I'd like to break in another way. And so here's a way of forcing it to break in a different way. Okay, so there are other extensions like dynamical models. So we're interested in encoding dynamics, so that in the latent space you say that each data point is related, it moves only slowly. So that's like combining the Kalman filter. So if you put a Gaussian process prior on this latent space, and then you have this nonlinear mapping to data space, that's going back to a Kalman filter but with a nonlinear emission. And you can do that here, and that works pretty well. And that, with the dynamical prior, this is the result for that stickman. Now it gives you this inner groove effect. Yeah? And that's talking about the inner groove distortion. Oh, and then there's, what was this final one here? Motion capture data without dynamics, with autoregressive dynamics. Oh, and this is a regressive dynamic. So these are two different types of dynamical model on the latent space. So putting in time on the latent space. So in these cases, what I'm saying is I now have a P of X given T, right? So I've got a prior over what X should be, and I combine it with this. I don't integrate over X because that's intractable, but I just do a map solution. I find the maximum a posteriori solution given this prior over X. And the first example is an autoregressive prior, that thing, and then the one on the right is actually a Gaussian process prior over X given T. Now, and this is going to take us on. So once I put a Gaussian process prior over X given T, that leads me into what we're going to talk about after lunch, which is the latest thing, which is I have a Gaussian process representing my data here. And what we're going to do after lunch is put another Gaussian, this is what we've just done. Gaussian process over X, Gaussian process over Y. And this is what I called, well, originally I called hierarchical Gaussian processes, but now that we've got better algorithms, we call it deep GPs. So stacking Gaussian process models one on top of another. So after lunch, we'll come in, we'll do the lab for week 4, which covers these latent variable models and how they're implemented in GPy. It will cover some stuff that I haven't talked about. So what we have now, I've talked always about optimizing X, right? So what we have now is the ability to variationally integrate out X. And it's a reasonably complex thing that we do, but guess what? It entirely depends on that inducing variable bound I talked about yesterday. That's the thing that allows us to do it. In fact, the work was done with Michalis Tsitsias. He was the one that spotted that we could do it because he derived that inducing bound. And he said, Neil, we can integrate out X. And I'm like, yeah, we can't. And then so he said, no, I'll show you. I'll give a talk. Okay, great. Oh, we could approximately integrate out X. And that means we can put priors over X that are Gaussian priors or even non-Gaussian priors. And therefore we can put Gaussian process priors over X. And that's the sort of thing we're doing at the moment. In my group, we're trying to combine these deep Gaussian process models with big data, with non-Gaussian likelihoods, to really look at exciting data sets. So that's, I'm bringing you right up to speed with where my research group is today. Everyone in the group is kind of working on things like this. So you will see in the lab the first stage of that, integrating over X, and some results with that, which means we can select the latent dimensionality. It's really cool. It works really well. Or maybe what I might end up doing is giving you a little bit of the deep GP talk to introduce you to that first, and then you'll do that in the lab. And then after that, I'll show you some of the results that aren't yet in GPy on how deep GPs work. So the idea with deep GPs is this sort of thing, that, well, this is the original hierarchical Gaussian process, that here we've got two subjects that are interacting together. So I've got a GPLVM on this guy and a GPLVM on this guy. And then I have a GPLVM that controls the both of them. Yeah? So this was the early work we did in 2007. And here we couldn't integrate over the latent variables. We just did a map solution. And then we also had work where we looked at the body. So we sort of had GPLVMs controlling the arms, the head, the abdomen, the left and right leg. And then another GPLVM controlling, so a GPLVM controlling the upper body, GPLVM controlling the lower body, and then a king GPLVM controlling the whole body. And the idea was here that we could then decompose the body into parts. The thought was, look, okay, it's all very well jointly modeling how I walk like this, but if I wave at you, that's messed up the model totally, because the model doesn't know about waving. Bring data on waving so that we can train the model again. But here, the idea would be this is a conditional independence, that when that happened, you would realize that this node had lost control over the arm. And your general arm model would switch in, yeah? So the arm had become independent of the walk. And so we did some tracking work with that, backing off on that. But I'll show you the demo of that when we get back after lunch. Okay, so we'll continue at 2:30. Sorry to overrun slightly. Questions?
In the GPLVM, you have like independence in the feature, right?
Yeah.
But I guess you can train the hyperparameters of the kernel with the data that you have right now. But if some other data point comes later, you can just optimize the X for that.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question. The question I think you're asking is, so when the new data point comes in, we just optimize X. We don't update the hyperparameters. Absolutely, yeah. You should be updating the kernel hyperparameters as well. But we don't. We just update X. In fact, officially, you should do the whole training exercise again. But we don't do that. What we do is we condition on the new point, y star given y, the training data, comma x, the optimized latent variables, comma x star, oh, that's star I've written, x star, and also conditioned in here are the kernel parameters alpha and whatever else. That's our prediction now, and we just optimize x star. So you could arguably say that we should be optimizing x as well, but we don't. We just optimize x star. Even weirder, if we get 5 new points coming in at the same time, we've now got a vector of y's and a matrix of x stars, comma alpha. Officially, we should jointly optimize over all these x stars in order to optimize this new vector of y stars. But we don't normally. The one time when we do is if this is a sequence. So if it's like we've been training the GPLVM on dynamical sequences of people walking, and then we get a new person walking coming in, or part walk or something like that, as a test point, and we want to, or maybe it's a partial walk, you only observe my left side, people look at data like this, then we have a prior over x star given t, which is correlated, and we fit those new y's all jointly together, like fitting a new mini GPLVM. But very good question. It's not clear, because we're doing this weird stuff with introducing parameters. The sort of totally right way is not totally obvious. We haven't explored it much because this seems to work pretty well, doing it this way. But if someone were to come along and said that's all wrong, I could believe, there's a better way. Other questions? Okay, so we'll come back after the break and do deep GPs. Well, we'll do the lab class first, and then we'll do deep GPs.